with that, I'd like to introduce our session presenter today over to my right here. So today's session is about scoping or requirements gathering. So scoping and requirements gathering is perhaps one of the most misunderstood aspects of any technical project. This seems to occur regardless of which implementation methodology is chosen. Jill's framework was a little agile or waterfall-y, whichever one of those, or if there's another one that you've got, I'd love to see that in the comments.
It's got to end with LY.
Yes. So when scoping fails, either because it's not done at all, or because it's not done effectively, or done ineffectively, I should say, someone has to pay, so the client or the implementer. Either the project goes massively over budget or it fails to deliver as expected. So sometimes those expectations are unrealistic, and nevertheless, unrealistic expectations can derail the project. So as Jill often says, and I think this is a coined phrase, and I will please excuse me here, I'm reading, assumptions make an ass of you and me. So that's just keeping that in mind is why it's crucial to get it right, and that's why we're all here today. So in this presentation, Jill Walker here to my right is the CRM Success Catalyst. And she will be talking to us about why scoping is so important and show us some techniques for working with clients and how to get that right and deliver successful projects. So Jill has been playing with Power Platform and Dynamics 365 and Microsoft CRM since 2002. So good experience under your belt there. Yes. She holds a range of certifications, and earlier this year was voted most trusted CRM advisor by Influential Businesswoman's Awards. So with scoping your CRM for success, please join me to welcome the CRM Success Catalyst, Jill Walker.
So today I'm going to share with you why scoping is important, since, as Kat said, it is so often misunderstood, not done badly, and then when the inevitable happens, people say, but why? But before we get into that, I am Jill Walker, the CRM Success Catalyst, and I've been playing with this stuff for 20 years. I first cut my teeth on CRM, Microsoft CRM, long before Dynamics was part of the vernacular. Microsoft CRM 1.0 beta. And oh boy, has it changed since then. So let's start with what is scoping. Scoping is working out within a project what we should include and what we shouldn't include.
And perhaps the latter is more important than the former. What should we do now? And what should we do later? Where are the low-hanging fruit? So how can we deliver value to our users from where they are now, quickly and efficiently? And what is a minimal viable product? Because of course, whenever you start one of these projects, your users are where they are. That might be stating the obvious, but it's a truism. They are doing their jobs, and they are not going to thank us, the IT whiz kids, or however they see us, or the people who don't understand their job, or whatever. And some of the ways that they'll see us might not be very complimentary. If we give them some new whiz-bang technology that does half of what their current system, even if that current system is notepads and pencils. If notepads and pencils are better than what we give them, and not in our opinion, in their opinion, we are not going to be popular. And not only will we not be popular at that point, we've created a situation where even if a short while later we give them something that's got every bell, every whistle known to man and makes their job super duper easy, that initial deployment has given us a massive mountain that we need to climb. And we've really done things, we've made a real rod for our own backs. So it's very important that you're aware that your users are where they are. Every deployment that you send out into the world needs to be better than the one before, and better from those users' perspectives. Not us saying, but you were on version 1, now you're on version 3, of course it's better. Look at it from their perspective. And that looking at it from their perspective will be a recurring sub-theme that you'll hear throughout this presentation. And it is something that so many techies fail to do. So I've looked a little bit in terms of scoping is taking that whole mass of things that we could give to our client and working out what we will, what we won't, what's now, what later, and so on. As well as that, another aspect is getting everyone onto the same page. So one of the things that you need to achieve when you are scoping is getting your key stakeholders, and that's your users, the managers, probably the board or the CIO. It will vary from project to project, but whoever those stakeholders are, we need to get them onto the same page. So we need to get a consensus so we know that this project is delivering to that customer, not that person, that customer, and whether it's 3 users, 103 users, or 3,000 users, we are delivering something, and that body needs to be happy with what we're delivering. And that also can be challenging. Scoping is absolutely the foundation of your project. If scoping goes wrong, or as Kat said in the intro, if it doesn't happen at all, you're on a downhill slide from here on in. If scoping goes wrong, you really are struggling to succeed. So why is scoping so important? And I'd like to ask you, why is scoping so important before I give you my opinion? So people online, people in the room, what are your thoughts about why scoping is so important?
Well, it gives us a roadmap, right?
Absolutely, it gives us a roadmap.
Understanding what the needs are.
Understanding the needs of the users rather than our thoughts, that it's dynamic CRM and it's got all of these cool features, and you as a user body will love all of those cool features, maybe.
Lyndon on the call says sets clear boundaries for both the customer and partner.
Love that. Great, Gladyn.
Get a bigger picture so you understand what you're dealing with.
Yeah.
Maybe limit surprises down the track if you can scope correctly at the start.
Absolutely. It does or should eliminate surprises, and that feeds in nicely to what Gladyn said in terms of creating boundaries. That's also part of what I said of what's in and what's out. We could say that that boundary falls between the ins and the outs. So all of those are important. I would take it a few steps further. So in my opinion, scoping underpins, first of all, the development or the build of what you are going to deliver to your people. Because after all, the scoping is the agreement of we will deliver leads and opportunities, we'll do quotes later on. So if someone complains after that initial phase, but I can't do a quote, well, we'll do that later. And that's what we agreed in the scoping in that hypothetical example. It also underpins your testing, because when you do the testing, and this is most facets of testing, what you should be testing is, does what you've delivered work or deliver the scope? And finally, it underpins training. So with both, well, all three of those, without a scope, what are you going to build? Who knows? Who cares? So having built something that's who knows, who cares, how do we decide if a particular test passes or fails? And once we've gone through a who knows, who cares, and we've tested and we've got some results, and then we train users, what are we going to train the users on? I don't know. So the three areas that are underpinned in your project, three core areas. So if scoping goes wrong, or you don't do scoping, one or the other, or you go through some vague exercise, but you don't really do scoping, I'm going to take a phrase that I use elsewhere. If you do tick box scoping, so that you can say, we've done scoping, but you haven't really, you are fairly likely to end up with a house like this rather than the one that you planned. And when the rains come, which they never do in Australia, and the ground gets soggy, I don't want to be living in that, thank you very much. Scope creep.
I know that.
Scope creep is the, maybe not quite the death knell, but it is bad news to any project. However, how on earth can you say you've had scope creep if there wasn't a scope to begin with? So sure, we had a number. We said, yeah, we can deliver you something for some number. How do we know that we've succeeded or failed if we didn't have a scope against which we built, we tested, and we trained? It's not possible. And scope creep sends time and cost up, and it sends your resources, your effort, and budget basically are on the skids. Now, I'm currently helping a project that is very much in that situation at the moment. And I can say with all honesty that both sides are really, really unhappy. So this is a project to do leads and opportunities, and it's already 12 months late. I'll fill in the dots when I'm not wired for sound.
Just on that, Jill, I think that's a very good point. A relationship, for example, with the customer also pays in the scope creep buckets.
Absolutely.
You can damage relationships significantly to the point of no return when that happens.
Let's drill into that, Kath, because I agree with you. So fundamentally, there are two ways that we can price a project. There's variations that sort of sit between these, but let's look at the two extremes. One is we quote the client, we will work for you for X dollars per hour. And If we spend 10 hours, it's going to cost you 10x. If we spend 1,000 hours, it's going to cost you 1,000x, and so on. Now, from the client perspective, that is really nice, because what is the project going to cost? And telling me that it's going to cost me X dollars an hour really doesn't work.
No.
I want to know what the project. And again, what do we mean by the project? Well, what we mean by the project is the scope. Another story that I tell is when I get these really woolly scopes is how much will it cost for us to go out to dinner? Or how much will it cost to go out for dinner tonight? Well, you would be a fool to give me a number at that question. How many people are coming? What style? Because at risk of stating the obvious, me and a friend, if you're lucky, going to Macca's is a little bit cheaper than taking all of us for a 5-course meal with linen napkins, silver service.
Yeah.
So that's one area. So we can do the cost per hour. Now, when scope creep happens in the cost per hour, as the implementers, we're okay. But the client is not going to be happy because they're getting bill after bill, or maybe not. Maybe they're going to get an almighty bill at the end of it, and then they're going to be even less happy. And that is where, as Kath said, we're watching our relationship go down the skids, and we may well be shown the door and told to use it. The alternative is we go fixed price. Now, when you go fixed price, anyone that goes fixed price without a scope is, well, daft would be the politically correct term, I think I could probably get away with in a public forum. Because again, if you say it's going to cost $1,000 or whatever, I realise these are small numbers for the world that we're in, but it doesn't matter. If you say it's going to cost $1,000, $1,000 for what, please? There's an awful lot of things I can think of where $1,000 is way more than I'd be prepared to spend. There's also an awful lot of things where if you said $1,000, I'd be saying, sign me up. And there's a lot that fall in between those two. So fixed price with no scope, the person giving the fixed price is going to be unhappy, almost certainly. So if you didn't get it already, you're probably now seeing why scoping is so important.
Jill, we just have some comments in the
Sure.
this as well, just to add. Just to add, hopefully everyone can hear me. Bledden's made some really good comments around scope change versus scope creep. And sometimes it's necessary and it's not a bad thing.
True.
And I absolutely agree there. As well as, for example, a great example is when, for example, you've scoped out a project at the start and clearly defined the goals, but later Microsoft introduces some new functionality that the customer wishes to add. I'm getting giggles in the room, the mic's not picking it up because everybody seems to have experienced this.
Would never. No.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's when it's good to have clear boundaries with your customer and your partner so that you can manage the additional scope for a project.
And I think it's a fair point that scope change is acceptable because effectively what we then have is we've got the scope with a price, and then we've got extra scope with a price. And that's fine. That is very different to scope creep. Scope creep is that sort of thing that just happens. And it may well only be picked up when the timesheets that often get converted to invoices in some form hit someone, and that's when people start to get unhappy.
Yeah.
So I'm now going to go through some points that are worth considering when you're looking at doing scoping. And these are points that technical people often don't consider too much. They are, well, they're aspects from a sort of more business user perspective. And believe it or not, I have worked with, I'm going to call them implementers, who they've been on a project for 6 months and they don't know how their client, whether it's their direct client or if they're employed and it's their employer's client, makes their money. They're in there implementing whatever they're implementing, and they don't know fundamentally where their wages are coming from. Now, I find that quite worrying. If someone had only been on the project for a few days, it might be excusable. But I've worked with people, or I've met people, would be a bit more honest, who've been on a project for many months. And they work for XYZ partner, who's working for some company, and they have got no clue what some company does, where some company's revenue comes from. And I find that quite worrying. And we may have those people who are designing a scope for a project. And they're likely to be the people that will say, well, the scope is whiz-bang new feature this, whiz-bang new feature that, whiz-bang new feature some other. Great, fine. So the first point I want to make is a comparison between good CRM and bad CRM. So a good CRM solution, and this is almost irrelevant of the technology that we've built the solution on. A good CRM will manage the process of looking after customers or clients well. And typically the process of good CRM looks something like that. Artistic license being excused. Bad CRM just gets in the way. And that is what bad CRM often looks like. So bad CRM is where we've got a lot of rekeying of data. Maybe where we've got people sending emails. So doing something, whatever something is, sending an email to a colleague to say, I've just done, now can you do whatever the next bit is? And of course, sometimes they don't even know whether they've sent the email to the right person, or maybe they have sent it to the wrong person. So lots and lots of examples. So I'd now like you people, both in the room and online, to think, what should a good CRM provide? So we'll have a bit of a conversation, and Kath, if you can stay keyed in with the people online, and then I will give you my thoughts. So this side's been very quiet, and I'm sure you've got a little bit of exposure. What's CRM between you? And I paid you?
Oh. I'm drinking. I think for me, ease of use, something that's, easy to follow without something that's so complicated that you've almost got to pull a manual out every time you need to engage with it, because rubbish in, rubbish out.
Absolutely.
Something which improves my day, which normally is full of something, tasks, and it helps me to do my work faster, better, more effectively.
Yeah.
Yeah, a good user experience.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. So we've got a good user experience, easy to use, something that makes my day better. Kath, have we got any contributions online?
We have some typing away.
Okay. Yes. You see, you should have come and joined us. It's much easier to speak than to type.
So we've got a good dynamic system should meet the business needs, not just for now, but also provides the opportunity for future business needs, future proofing, scalability, those key aspects to growth in
Yes.
any system. Yes, good one.
Lots of buzzwords in there.
Mm.
Who's got a booking for buzzword bingo tonight? Okay, so yes, so let's now look. I think you've largely covered these. So what we want, and this is a fairly sort of global definition. First of all, a good CRM should make data entry, whatever data entry is needed, it should be as easy as possible and as little as possible. One of the points that I raise in some of my presentations, but I haven't got it here, but I'll tell you anyway, is aiming for worm. Now, worm, for the people who've not met my friend yet, is write once, read many. In other words, in an ideal system, any one data element only gets entered once and then gets sent by whatever means are necessary to wherever it's needed so it can be read once. And taking that to the next level, wherever possible, let's get the prospect or the customer or the client to do that data entry. Because in most instances, the customer, prospect, client are not on our payroll. So that way we get data entry for free. So what we want is to get data entry only done once and where feasible done by cheap people, or better still, free people.
Lovely.
We also want something that guides the users, who may of course be the prospect or the client, through a process. So whatever they need to do, let's take a very simple example. We get a lead from somewhere. We've been handed a business card. We get that data into the system by whatever means possible. We then get reminded to make a phone call. We make a phone call. We qualify that lead. We have an opportunity, and so it goes on. But it shouldn't be down to the users to remember all of that. It sounds simple when we've got one lead, but when you've got lots of leads and lots of people, remembering to make all of those calls, if that's the process, may well be challenging. So what can we do to get CRM to make sure that all of those calls to all of those people are made? We also want to automate as many of those routine tasks as possible. And we want to give information to whoever needs it and is entitled to it when they need it. So the 4 things that we need a good CRM solution to do. First of all, we want it to be easy data entry. Secondly, we want it to guide users. Thirdly, we want as much as possible taken away from those wage-grabbing users and given either to automation or to outsiders, the client or the prospect, to do. And finally, we want to give the necessary information, data, reports, whatever they are, to people when they need it. So a big part of that, and where people often focus in their scoping, is inputs and outputs. So I'm now going to look at inputs and outputs in a little bit more detail. So inputs are all of the ways that we can get information into the system. And outputs are all of the ways that the system can give us, and I'm using that as a very global us, information that we need to do our job. So if we look at those in a little bit more detail, inputs might be paper forms that someone, whoever they are, fills in, and they find their way to someone else's desk, and then we get that information into the system. They might be websites. So we've all experienced going to a website, filling in some data on a form, and it finding its way into the system. They might be phone calls, they might be meetings, or they could be scientific instruments feeding data in, measuring temperature and lots of other things that we could measure. All of those are forms of input, and there's probably others. Then we start looking at outputs, and outputs are dashboards. That's a fairly common one when you're having a conversation with a client as to what do you need. Coming up with a dashboard is one. Reports, form letters of various forms, so personalised letters, and getting those sent quickly, simply, or maybe totally automatically. And even something like that till receipt that I squeezed in at the bottom, that's also an output. Often when people are scoping, they put an awful lot of focus on inputs and nowhere near as much on outputs. However, I'd now like to ask you, which is most important? And again, same to people online. We've thought about inputs, we've thought a little bit about outputs. Which is most important?
Oh, they're both equal. So you need to have a clear, they're both equal. You need to have a clear input to get a great outcome.
Sure. So we need a clear input to get the output, and I would agree completely with that.
I think there's an echoed message from earlier on rubbish in, rubbish out.
Absolutely. Yep. So before I give my opinion on the topic, which I will in a moment, I'm going to introduce you to a couple of my friends.
Alice asked the Cheshire Cat, who was sitting in a tree, "What road do I take?" The cat asked, "Where do you want to go to?" "I don't know," said Alice. Then said the cat, "It really doesn't matter." So we do need to be thinking about what we want to get out and take those, and from that, what do we need to put in order to get what we want out. Stephen Covey gave us a slightly more succinct and possibly more businesslike and professional way of thinking about this when he said many years ago, begin with the end in mind. So think about what you need out of the system and then craft your inputs so you get what you need out.
So back to inputs and outputs. I think we should think about it the other way round. So outputs and inputs. What are the outputs that you need, and what are the inputs that you need to get those outputs? Nevertheless, inputs do come before outputs in the overall scheme of what we're doing. And how we get from an input to an output is commonly thought of as the business process. But in reality, the process goes from the beginning of the input to the end of the output. And we need to know how to achieve that, remembering all along that it's the output is the end game and the important point. So going a little bit more into the processes, what are they? Well, first of all, they are the steps. So again, taking a fairly simple example, how do you enter a lead into Dynamics 365? Now, I'm not actually asking for an answer to that question.
Thank you.
But what are the steps that our users need to follow to do whatever? Then let's think about the stakeholders. So stakeholders are users, they're the management, they're board, they're all the people who have an vested interest in this process. And most importantly, perhaps, what are the goals? And this also feeds into my favourite three-letter word, why. So even if we're looking at a very simple example and I'm saying, here's a business card, go and put it into Dynamics 365 as a lead, why am I asking you to put it into Dynamics 365? Why should you put it into Dynamics 365? What do we as a collective whole get from putting that business card into Dynamics 365 as a lead? All hypothetical questions you'll be glad to know.
So when we are thinking about processes and we've got all of those steps, I like to think about all of that very much like a dance. And the reason I use a dance is because when you do a dance, particularly a folk dance, as this image is, but also almost any other dance really, everyone is doing the same thing, sort of. But there's room for personalisation. Some people will work fast, some people will work slow, some people are more skilled and add all kinds of twirls and bits and pieces. Other people are still learning and struggle to put their left foot in front of their right, vaguely in time with the music. But nevertheless, we're all doing roughly the same thing. So when we're talking about these processes, we need to get some form of flowchart. What needs to happen?
And I first developed some of what I'm about to teach you when we get a bit further on about 25 years ago when I was working for Microsoft, helping them implement a pre-Dynamics, a long-time pre-Dynamics, Clarify and Siebel. And we needed to work out the business processes. And I facilitated that quite simply by saying, what happens next? So a phone rings. What happens next? You answer the phone. What happens next? You find out who's on the other end. What happens next? And that is one way that you can work through to end up with a map, something like this. A simple map like this will probably have three components. So it will have actions, which are those squarish lumps on the flowchart. It will have branches, which are the diamonds. So let's take a simple example on that hypothetical phone call. Do you know your account number? Well, that's a straight up either yes or no. If yes, please tell me your account number. If no, please tell me something else and I'll help you find it. And we'll have a start and a finish. So that is the lowest level of process that I would be looking for from a client that I'm working with when I'm doing scoping. If it's possible I push to get it to this level, which is a very different process. Don't worry about that. I was somewhat limited by what I could find online, and I wasn't about to create my own. But this one also says who does what. So on this one, we can see that we've got the customer doing something, then we've got sales doing something, contracts, legal, fulfillment. And that will also help us greatly when we're doing an implementation in terms of lots of things about what do we do first, what apps do we use, and so on. So that is what on any CRM, whether it's Dynamics 365 or another technology, that's what I'd be hoping to get. But if I can't get that, I'll settle for that. But anything less than that, and we'll have words. So you've already met my favourite 3-letter word. I'm now going to explain why is so important. It's essential that when you get given a requirement, both you and the client know why that requirement is being asked for. That's another way of avoiding scope creep, because I would guess somewhere of the order of between 1 in 2 and 1 in 5 of your I think we should do can get thrown out by asking that why question. Because a little more questioning, and I can give you some other real world examples from one of my current projects that got missed with why do you want the owner to be, or the person to be recorded in that way? And what happens when that person leaves the organisation? What happens when that person assigns, to use a technical word, a piece of work to a colleague? And they were things that had not been thought out. People had jumped in, rolled their sleeves up, implemented a field to hold the name of a person. Then when a user leaves the organisation, or the, in this case, lead gets assigned, all hell breaks loose because, well, that wasn't a requirement that was given. It also wasn't questioned by people who ought to know. I also strongly recommend, but I'll admit this is incredibly hard to enforce, that you don't allow anybody, whatever their title, to make decisions beyond their level of understanding. I'll let that one sit for a moment. Please don't allow people to make decisions beyond their level of understanding. What is the impact of that decision? What happens if? So there's a whole heap of questions that you need to ask. And all of this needs to be done before anybody rolls up their sleeves and implements. And I'm going to illustrate this why with a story. So in Australia and in America, most railways are 4 foot 8.5 wide. That is the gauge. Yes. Now, why are US and Australian railways 4 foot 8.5 in this day of metric? Well, the answer to that question is because British Railways, which predated them, were 4 foot 8.5 wide, and the same manufacturers made the rolling stock and the tracks, so same measurement was used. So why are British Railways 4 foot 8.5 inches wide? Because before the railway, we had, I am British in case you haven't noticed, we had horse and carts. And horse and carts had wheels that were 4 foot 8.5 inches on average apart. So why did our carts back in the 1700s have wheels that were roughly 4 foot 8.5 inches apart? Well, they were the ones that fitted in the ruts in the road. And the ruts in the road had been made by previous horse and carts that had wheels that were 4 foot 8.5 inches wide.
Gold star for you.
So why? Yes, you don't want your axles to break too often, and if you decide to have 4 foot wide or 5 foot wide, and the ruts in the road are 4 foot 8.5, then you're going to break the axles, and that costs money and it's inconvenient, and you truck your carts off the road and so on. But why 4 foot 8.5 inches wide? The answer is because Roman chariots drawn by 2 horses had wheels that were 4 foot 8.5 inches, because that is the width of the bums of 2 horses. So we now in New South Wales, 10,500 miles away from Rome, 2,000 years roughly since the end of the Roman Empire, have railways that are the width of 2 horses' bums in the Roman era. Now, you can laugh. However, are you doing things in your business that are about as realistic as we have railroads that fit 2 bums of a Roman horse? So now I'm going to talk to you about 4 mistakes that are commonly made in process mapping and scoping. So the first mistake is too much detail. Forgetting that the process is like a dance, and we all need, or maybe not need, but we'll all probably end up doing something a little bit different. And we don't want it to be so rigid and prescriptive. In other words, we're failing to see the wood for the trees. Another mistake is seeing it far too much from the perspective of the seller than the buyer. I'm sure we've all spoken to a utility company, a bank, a financial, a phone company, whatever, and you phone, you give a certain amount of information, it gets passed to someone else. Excuse me, could you give me your name, please? What's your account number? I've told him that. So let's think about this from the perspective of the other person, the client, not the seller. Thinking about a process without any results or metrics. So I alluded to that earlier. Why are you entering that lead into Dynamics 365 or whatever tool you use? Yes, I know I've told you to. I know I gave you a business card, but why? What are we going towards? What will we ultimately measure off the back of that lead? Which is also another aspect of the whole why. And finally, buying a process from somebody else. I'm sure that process works for them, but are you in the same business as them? And even if you're in the same industry, do you do things the same way as they do? My guess is no and no. But so how do we get the scope from our client? I like to do it through one or a series of workshops. And I use, in those workshops, I always have several people. Because again, I am looking at getting the organisational opinion of what we need. I don't consider it my job to come away with a list and a list. So you want ABC, you want ABF, you want DEG, you want IJK. It's not my job to then look at that lot and say, well, B is really important and K is a waste of time. What do you, as the client, think is important? We need to have people from different areas of the business. That also reduces the probability of implementing something that works for department, team, group A, but makes it impossible to implement something that department, group, team B need. So let's have all the relevant people in the room. Let them argue whether A is more important than D or I or F. It's not us as an outsider to their business job to work that out. So when I'm running these workshops, I have a series of conversations. I call them conversations, but they are sections where specific information that I am looking at getting, and from which I can write an action plan, I can price up an implementation, I can do pretty much whatever it takes to move that project forward. So the first conversation is more for my benefit than the client's, but it's surprising how often certain people in the room from the client will learn from this. And this conversation is an overview of the business. What does this business do? Where does its money come from? Who does it look after? What are the key things? So that's that first conversation. That's relatively quick. Then we look at the key performance indicators or KPIs of the project. And what I mean by the key performance indicators of the project are what are the things that we need to give you at the end of this project for you unequivocally to say this project has been a success. So they again will be quite high level. So maybe we need to be able to capture all our leads that have come into the website and report on them. Maybe we need to be able to record every phone call that comes into the building and get some dashboards from it. And there's lots of other things. But what are the key things? And I'd be limiting this to a dozen. So this is not your full-blown functional, non-functional requirements, although it will guide you in the functional, non-functional requirements. This area might also give you some clue about the IT environment of the organisation. So if it must run on Firefox, for the sake of argument, all of our users use Firefox, so whatever you give to us has to work on Firefox. Now, that may or may not be good. That's not what we're here to decide, but it may be important for a client. And if it is, let's get it out here. And if we are going to struggle to deliver on it, it's better to leave now than to do $1 million worth of development and it doesn't run on Firefox. What is your customer journey? So any customer goes on a journey from when they first have identified a problem through to researching, identifying you as a potential provider, purchasing from you, making referrals to you, and being a raving fan of your services. Now, I'm not saying everybody that comes into your world will go the whole way. That would be a bit of a fairy story, but there's the customer journey. Now we get into the more juicy bits. So what are the processes that we need to deliver? And these pieces are by no means equally weighted. So the processes, I will teach people how to map processes, and I then work with them to do that mapping. I often start the process, as you might recall from a slide a couple ago, using butcher's paper and post-it notes on the wall. Then, of course, we start looking at what are the outputs. So what are the dashboards? What are the reports? What are the letters that we need Dynamics to give us? What data do we need to consider? And this, of course, feeds into data migration, integration points, other data lumps that might be sitting around the office that we need to think about, that might give us clues about other areas of development. Who are the people that are going to be involved in this project? So that is the stakeholders, but it's also the end users. And when we look at all of those people, are we dealing with people that are technologically literate? Are we dealing with people who would love the opportunity to go and develop their own apps to help them do whatever they need to do? Or are we dealing with people who don't know how to save a file? Now, both of those exist out there. I'm not knocking either of them. But what we deliver to a group of people who would happily run away and develop their own apps is going to be vastly different to what we deliver to a group of people who struggle to save a file. And finally, what key dates do we need to consider for the project? So do we absolutely have to be live by the beginning of the financial year? Does the company have 2-3 weeks off over Christmas that, if we don't know about it, could dent our project planning and our costing quite radically, and a lot of other areas? So if you get detailed answers to those 8 conversations, you will be in a strong situation to then start to build a scoping document and even jump into the design document. Sounds quite simple. When you start doing it, it might be a little more challenging. And this workshop is something that I've evolved over the last 23 years. It's a technique I was introduced to when I was working in Malaysia before the Sydney Olympics, before I moved to Sydney. And I've evolved it and I've made it much more specific to Dynamics. So, when you are working through this with a client and you're asking questions, take a piece of advice from Einstein. Make it as simple as possible, but not simpler. In other words, don't dumb it down to get to the point that people are basically giving you the wrong answer because you've dumbed it down so much that you're now asking the wrong question. And for me,
a key part of getting all of this to work is doing what I call envisioning education. So before I even kick off a scoping workshop, I strongly advocate that the key people do some training about what Dynamics 365 gives them out of the box. Because if we assume that we're talking to an organisation that has made the decision to go with Dynamics, essentially they've budgeted and they are paying for all of that functionality that we know is in Dynamics 365. Our scoping then takes that to the next level.
But if nobody in the scoping knows what's available out of the box, you will get things like, we must capture people's addresses. Well, as I've said to more than one client, and probably got myself into trouble for so doing, it would cost us more using Dynamics to not enable address capture than to enable it. So let's not bother wasting time with, we must capture addresses and we need a street and a second street, we need to know the flat number and we need to know the suburb. You get all of that lot. Tick, done. Let's move on and work on what we need. Take it to the next level. What do you need in your business over and above the out of the box stuff? And you cannot have that conversation if you are the only person in the room that knows out of the box functionality. And if even you don't know that the out of the box functionality, and you're just there saying, well, we'd like to capture addresses and email addresses are quite cool, and you're in trouble.
Fun question. Sorry.
What you have.
Yeah, I do. Sorry. That's what I miss about the digital one. Just stick your hand up, not interrupt the speaker. I'm just putting my hand up. Have you ever experienced pushback from an organization about giving the base level training up front?
That's what I was thinking.
Because, I mean, for me, I think it's absolutely invaluable to have that. And all the conversations, we go, yeah, it does that. But at the same time, the user may be completely green. Yes, tech illiterate in some cases. So asking them to do some training on a completely different zone just to get a foundation when I've been in training sessions when people have gone into a new room and they don't know how to turn on the laptop. So, that's the...
I open this lid to begin with.
So, how would you manage that?
Typically, as I manage a lot of things, by telling a story. And the story that I tell will depend on the mood that I'm in.
You need to theme like a Disney, they tell story like scene and then.
No. Yeah. One of the stories that I tell is that the people who really agree with envisioning training are those who've experienced a failed implementation. Whether it's a failed implementation in their current organisation or in a previous organisation. They tend to jump on board. Another story that I will tell, and I'll pick whichever flavour of these I want, but a common one is, imagine you met a friend, and said friend is all excited. They've just bought a new house. And they tell you, we're going to paint the master bedroom purple, and we're going to put a barbecue out the back, and there's going to be a fish pond over there, and we're going to put 93 goldfish in the pond, and we're going to have daffodils down there. How many bedrooms does your new house have? Don't know. Haven't visited it. Look good on the estate agent blurb. What's your thought about that friend that knows that the master bedroom needs to be purple, knows that the fish pond they're going to build will take 93 goldfish, knows that they can put daffodils over there, but they don't know how many bedrooms there are, and they've just paid, well, if it's in Sydney, they've probably paid somewhere between 1 and 2 mil for it. It's more than I earn in a week, I'll tell you that much. So I like to bring it back to very much a personal level. And I've got 3 modes that I use. So there's buying a house, there's building an extension to a house, there's making a bespoke suit, and there's cooking a meal. They're my main ones. And I've got lots of variants within them.
The kit bag, yeah.
And I will illustrate them. And I just pluck. I've also got, of course, 20 years experience plus 10 years of other CRM. There's a story or two that will come out of there. And a number of years ago, I was working in India, and one of the things that sticks in my mind about that project was one of the senior managers of the company saying organizations need to implement CRM, forget the technology, but CRM 3 times to get it right. The first 2 are the learning ground to get the 3rd one right. Now, yes, it was 20 years ago and still a lot has changed, but I honestly think if we look at our client base, a lot of them will be on attempt 2 or attempt 3.
Yeah, that's true.
Now, some of that gets masked by Agile, but the project that I'm currently on, we're wrapping up what will be attempt 2 because nobody used attempt 1. And if I'm reading the tea leaves correctly, I think attempt 3 will be starting soon after Christmas. They didn't do envisioning education, and they want to do it right now before we kick off phase 3. Now, they weren't offered it. And so just to finish, envisioning education, I think, is empowering. And it doesn't take much to explain how the investment in 1 or 2 days of training with, yes, you'll need 8 or 10 or 12 people in the room, but those 2 days will be saved umpteen times over because I don't need to explain to you what a lead is, and 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 you what a lead is. I'm not going to tell any of you right now. I hope that you already know. But how long have we saved just from not explaining to a dozen separate people when we should use a lead rather than a contact, as one very simple example. So that's the sort of thing that I will do when I get pushback. Related to that, it's how you phrase it. So I would never sell people base level training because you will not get your CIO on base level training. However, you might get them on some empowering and visioning education.